So it's November 15th, and we're out in Walnut Creek at the Armstrongs, and we're going to introduce ourselves, starting with Greg.
Sure, I'm Greg Armstrong. I'm the middle son of 5 kids, and I worked with the rafting company. I retired recently, but I've worked with All Outdoors for the last 40 years, and yeah, I'm excited to talk about the Stanislaus.
Scott Armstrong, and I'm the youngest of the 5 kids, and Greg and I, our whole family worked in All Outdoors throughout the last 40 or 50, 60 years, but Greg and I had that as our careers and worked with my father George for years.
And I'm George, George Armstrong. I'm the one guilty of forcing these kids and other kids to do things. And now they're getting even with me. They tell me what to do. But it was great years, starting with the Stanislaus.
So I'm Larry Orman, and we're talking with the Armstrongs about their early history on the Stanislaus, especially the very early 1960s when George and then broadly his family became engaged with a place where nobody knew it was there.
Yeah.
So George, maybe tell us a little bit about how you first came to the Sierra foothills and eventually found the river.
My father, in around 1946 era, built a cabin in Strawberry near Pinecrest, and flowing by it was one of the stretches of the Stanislaus River. So when we were there regularly at the cabin in summer, talk went around with other people about things that people did on this other river, not our stretch, but another farther north one. People went rafting on it. Well, I had to find out what they're talking about. So, at Montgomery Ward's in Oakland, I ended up buying a little raft, about 4 feet by 8 feet. Takes 2 or 3, 4 people at the most. So, with my brother Larry and nephew Pete, we did go on the then unknown Stanislaus River. We didn't know anything about what we were doing.
What year would this have been?
Early 60s, 63, 4, around that era, in my recollection. So we had time on the river. Well, wait a minute. In the river. We spent half of the time with our lunch floating past us, and so that was the first experience, knowing nothing. But later, I took Greg and his brother Randy and my wife, and we went in that little boat, again trying out the Stanislaus River. We did a little better, but the first big rapid was not too good. The second one, Randy decided to walk out. My brother was in the car up on the road, and Randy hiked out, went up the hill to not be any more in the raft.
So what did you think about that?
Well, I kind of agreed with him. If he didn't like it, and I was worried too, because they were little.
5 and 6, 6 and 7.
5 and 6, around that. So, a couple more big rapids, and Greg decided he wanted to get out. So he hiked out. So that just left me and my wife to continue on down to the end of the river.
So on that trip, you would have gone all the way down to Parrott's Ferry?
Yeah. So by that time, I had learned a little bit, so that trip was better than the first one. Later...
On your first trip, who was with you on the first trip?
my brother Larry, and a nephew Pete. He was 16 or so, and so that was the first trip in the Montgomery Ward.
Do you remember much about that trip, of how it felt? Was it just confusing or exhilarating?
Not knowing what we were doing. I was kind of in charge, but none of us knew what we were doing, and we made it. We finally got to the end.
Do you recall seeing other people on the river at the time?
Nobody else. Either that or the next trip or several other, for a long time after. No other people. But in a later trip with my daughter in a knockdown kayak. Knockdown means
A full boat.
take it apart, put the canvas cover on. Well, we were in that knockdown boat, kayak, and we got caught on the brush on the side of the river. We were stuck. But along comes this guy in a big black boat, and he sees us there, comes over and, "Can I help you guys?" "Oh yeah, we're stuck." "Well, get in my boat and I'll take you down the river to the takeout, and we can maybe find some kayak parts along the way." Well, we got to know him a little bit in that rest of the trip. So later, I went to his house, his base, and ended up buying one of those big black boats from him. He was really, really helpful and tried to educate me as much as he could. Later, he called me. He had a question: would I be willing to go guide a boat, guide a raft, on a trip with a group of people who were high-top people that he wanted to educate about the value of the river.
And that person was?
That person was Bryce Whitmore. And so, okay, so I volunteered and went, and it was a learning thing for the people and for me.
So you were rowing one of the
Rowing a
boats
boat.
with oars?
And the people hold on. No paddles yet.
We're back with the Armstrongs talking about the early days on the Stanislaus River. In the break, you were talking about that one of the first trips and how many times the boat turned over. George, do you remember on those first trips, how many times you were in the water?
On the first trip, we were, again, I'm not exaggerating, in the water half of the time. The next trip with the two young boys who hiked out.
And your wife,
and
Dolores.
my wife. She and I did the balance of the trip to the takeout. We flipped a few times. There are always exaggerations in river stories. But we made it. And then back to the one with Sherry. And this guy came by, Bryce Whitmore.
This is in a full boat, collapsible kayak.
And we were in the kayak, had been, and got to know him. Ended up buying a boat from him, a raft, one of those big rafts, that helped us to then take more people, more family on trips. And we learned a little bit more to where we could get down a river without too much trouble, except one of the times, a big family and friends trip on the Stanislaus. There is on one of the bends a place that became famous called Razor Rock, because it had a good habit of tearing into rafts that bumped into it. that happened to us. We had the big black boat, and we had the little raft, and the big black boat got cut open enough that we couldn't repair it at the seam. So it happened that we had to, Mark, my son, hiked all the people out, and this other guy, who was one of my daughter's friends, he and I took the raft, the damaged raft, rolled up into our little raft, and the two of us went the rest of the river to get to down to where the vehicles were, where we then got the vehicles back up to the people who had been up on the road, wet and cold, till after midnight, waiting for us.
So they would have hiked out at Duck Bar, up the Duck Bar Road, Mariana Gulch.
That's the best they could do.
Oh,
Yeah.
man.
So that story went on for a long time.
Not exaggerated either.
No, not exaggerated.
So we're back with the Armstrongs talking about early trips on the Stanislaus, in this epic trip in which one of the boats was torn up at Razorback and people had to hike out. Greg, what's your memory of it?
We were stuck. I mean, we really didn't know. We didn't even know about the Duck Bar Road. We just saw a road going up. We didn't even know where it led to. So these guys are heading out and we're heading up and we're going, man, will we ever meet again? And
it's late in the day.
It's very late. Because Razorback, we took our time at Rose Creek and all these other places, so we were playing around. And I remember the sun was starting to set even early on, and it's going, wow. And then we have this boat that's got a slice all the way down the middle. And they did it, though. Dad was always never afraid and always moving forward. And that was another case when he was doing just that, even though the circumstances looked very dire. But back to that first trip that I was on, I think you were referring to, of where he had gone with Pete and Larry, his brother Larry and his cousin Pete, on that first trip. And then we went on a second trip. And we were young. We had these little collar life jackets. I can remember this. They're just like these little tiny things with a little strap around it. Flotation was almost nothing. And we thought my mom and dad were being very responsible and showing us this great trip. And I'll never forget, we go through Cadillac Charlie and Randy looks at me and goes, this is not a good idea. And I think, you big baby. It's mom and dad. We're going down the river. Mm. And he says, I'm walking on. I said, well, go for it, you bud. And we go down through Death Rock and I think we flipped. I'm pretty sure we did because the boat went one way and Dad went one way and then Mom and I got caught in the brush. And I remember hanging there, freezing cold water. I think it was spring. I got this little life jacket thing on, and she's got it on. And I looked at her and I said, "Are we going to die?" And she goes, "No, your dad's going to take care of us. Just stay right here." As she's hanging onto the brush, and so am I. And when he finally came around with the boat, I said, "You get in it, but I'm not." And then I hiked up to the steep embankment. I remember that, up to where Larry and Randy were, and we went back around, and we went all the way down to Parrots Ferry. And I remember I was fishing on a rock, waiting for them. It was getting dark again. I'm going, oh boy. And all of a sudden I look up, and here comes this little boat with these two people, wet as can be, floated right by, and that was it. They made it, and so did we.
What's your memory of your mom's experience of that trip?
My mom, and Scott will attest to this, and my dad as well, she was just a trooper. She did anything and everything and never complained, never doubted what was going on, never made any corrections, just sort of went with it. And in fact, I think if she wasn't that way, we would have walked out on a lot of other trips. And so she just kept steady, and Dad was learning and courageous and strong, and we trusted him too. And the combination of my mom and my dad on that first trip was pretty much typical of their entire marriage and life. So it was really cool. Yeah.